Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this much awaited update on the progress on the Space Infrastructure Hub. Thank you for taking the time to be here on this chilly winter's afternoon. I think I certainly don't want to take up more of your time than I need to in setting the scene before I hand over to Val and Tosh to cover some of the key points on the agenda. For those of you who I haven't met as yet, my name is Kamal Ramsing. I'm the chairperson of ZAR Space. And it is my absolute pleasure to invite you and members of the SANZA Exco to this brief update session. Now, I think it goes without saying that a successful design and execution of the Space Infrastructure Hub is something that we all want and something that we all see as being critical to the longevity of the sector that we all enjoy so very much. We have such talented individuals, we have such promising organizations in the upstream, in the downstream in our country. We have such a huge heritage of many, many years that we need to reclaim. And we all see the Space Infrastructure Hub as being fundamental to getting that right. It's critical that programs like these are now designed with industry benefication, local industry benefication at its very heart, at its core, and not something that's added on. And I know that Val and his team echo these sentiments, and I'm certainly looking forward to some of the progress updates that we're going to be looking at or hearing about in a short while. Now, you would have seen from the agenda that there are 4 key points that we're going to look to cover today. We've juggled them around a little, and Val and Tosh and the team might still juggle them around a bit more. We'll kick off shortly with just a progress update on where we are and how we've moved along, how SANZA has been able to move along on the bankable feasibility for the Space Infrastructure Hub. I think that's on top of everyone's minds, and it'll be key to get a good, clear understanding from Val and the team on where we're going with that. And then, as you might recall, a few months ago, ZAR Space led an industry consultation process, or concluded an industry consultation process that started at the end of last year. We're going to move over to understanding the SANZA response to that report. And I understand that Tosh will take us through that. And then Val has some really interesting content that he'd like to share, some parts of it certainly on where SANZA are reviewing aspects of the business model and potentially even some of the newer projects that are being looked at. At the end, and depending on what you'd like to discuss further, we'll talk about models and opportunities and even specific initiatives that you'd like as industry to launch to improve the co-creation, so making co-creation real within the Space Infrastructure Hub and potentially broader with some of the other initiatives that might be available. If I can ask you to hold your questions till the end of each section. So we'll run this with 3 distinct sections. Once Val is done with the update on the bankable feasibility work, we'll pause and take some Q&A from all of you, from the attendees, and so on, when we touch the second and the third sections. Of course, the comments are always open, and Herman, thank you again for your support and your assistance in putting this together. But the comments section stays open, so you can continue the interactions through that. With no further ado, if I can ask you to please keep your videos off and keep your microphones on mute. And I'm going to ask Val to join me as we set up for the first section of this, which is the updates on the bankable feasibility. Hello, Val.
Hi, Kamal.
I'm good, thanks. Good to see you again. I'm not going to delay the process, so I'm going to ask Herman to give you the floor, and we'll interact with you in a few minutes, Val. Thank you.
Okay, great. No, thanks, Kamal, for this opportunity. I think it was about time that we actually called for this meeting. It's been a while, actually, since we last engaged with the industry. I do have a presentation. So I'm actually joined by Eugene Avenant, who's our chief engineer at SANZA. So he'll talk about some of the technical work that he's been doing and leading within SANZA. And then we're also joined by Tosh, who's our new strategic manager, and we'll talk about some of the strategic aspects. So I'll chip in between the 2 colleagues. maybe if I can just flight my presentation quickly, and then I'm going to switch off my video to save some bandwidth. Just give me a second. There we go. Okay, so as I said, thanks again for this opportunity. There are essentially 4 aspects that we wanted to speak about in this particular presentation. We're going to start off with Eugene just coming in and giving us a brief update on the Space Infrastructure Hub and where we are at the moment. Then I'll speak around the co-creation of the ecosystem, and we've already had several conversations with Zarspace Inc. And I'll talk about some of the thoughts that we have already looked into. And then Intosh is going to come in, given the fact that the Zarspace Inc. has already done an extensive consultation around the SIH, and there's the SIH industry report. So he'll provide a high-level synopsis or viewpoint in terms of how we see the SIH industry report. And then I'll come back in at the end just to give you a sense as to what's happening within SANZA, just to embrace all of these developments and how we're going to move forward. So I'm going to start off with Eugene. Eugene, can you come in? And then I just ask you to move the slides forward when you've done. Thanks.
Yes, sorry, good afternoon. Just quickly, a quick visual just to say hi properly. Then I'm going to stop the video again. So yes, so quickly from our side, I hope you can hear me properly. Just a few slides just to give you an update on what's been happening in terms of physical progress on the projects and moving towards the SIH. A quick reminder, just on the SIH is based on what we call this space data, the space value chain, and the systems we want to be implementing are mapping into this value chain. So on this graph, then you can see in the graphics the value chain itself is starting with the user requirement at the top, going through the satellite segment, the ground station, the ground infrastructure, into the data infrastructure, and then ultimately delivery. So on top of that, we've got mapped the actual infrastructure projects we're working on. So starting with the satellite segment at the top, I see people are not enjoying the sound of my system. Let me just see if I can do something about it. Let me go out of this full screen view. Let's see. Yeah, it should not be too. Yeah, I'm gonna sort of push through, so hopefully you can hear reasonably well and understand what I'm saying. So the systems we're looking at is the satellite segment, the ground station, the GNSS side, and SPAS system, the data infrastructure, and the data visualization center. Okay, sorry, next slide, please. Okay, in order to realize the SIH, we need to look at the dependencies, the blockages, and the enabling technologies. So the previous slide, what I mentioned, the actual infrastructure we're building are those the blocks in the blue background, and then some of the enabling technologies are mapped in the orange. So they are also not just enabling technologies. In some cases, they actually form blockages as well. So in order for us to realize, for instance, the satellite segment, we need to have the concurrent design facility working. We need access to the AIP facility in Gabon. We have an enabling technology in the SATCOM strategy, in that it's going to be addressing additional work that can be done in the ground segment and satellite applications development, satellite data application development environment, as well as the data infrastructure. We're going to be using existing data sources. The space where the center, which we'll be talking about later on, is also an enabling technology towards additional satellite data applications development. But overall, you will see that the process starts on the left with the user requirement, and then ultimately tries to deliver SIH-enabled services on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. Okay, so what have we been doing since we last spoke to Zarspace Inc.? So on the project management side, we've been developing a high-level project management plan. So we've got work breakdown structures on all the thematic levels. And when I'm talking about thematic levels, I'm talking about the different sub-projects. So for instance, the ground segment, the space segment, the data infrastructure, and so forth. Okay, so just I'll try and sort out the background noise. Okay, so we've been doing a lot of work on the work breakdown, the scheduling of those thematic levels, and then also the appointment and allocation of human resources to the different parts of the project. One major part, and I'll touch on that in the next slide going forward, is some of the analysis and the reports we need to deliver for the SIH. So in terms of helping us to get to those reports that we need to deliver to Infrastructure South Africa, we've appointed GTEC, which is a sub division of Treasury, and specifically the Institutional Development Support Unit, to help us with a number of those things. So some of them are the economic analysis, the financial modeling, the infrastructure delivery life cycle, management and implementation. So where are we with that process? So dealing with government, you all know it takes a bit of a while. So we've finally been able to do the contracting, and setting up the project charter is finished, and we've just kicked off the work with GTEC. So our first workshop is then scheduled for next week already. So other issues that we're still addressing at this point in time is obviously, as a public entity, we have some difficulty to access finance. Some of them limited by our schedule. We are a scheduled public entity. Anyway, yeah, sorry about the sound. I think I'm running out of bandwidth at my home office here. We've got quite a few people working here together. But anyway, so some of the issues are the scheduling, the fact that we are not VAT registered, and our ability to borrow. And then one of the other issues is obviously the availability of the AIT facility. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of the thematic progress. So if we look at the ground station, as I reported last time, we intend to have a ground station in Maitiesfontein. Since last time, our environmental impact assessment has gone through and been approved, and we are about ready to deliver the first draft of our business plan. The ground station also has it's quite a topical thing for us at our space operations unit, as we have clients outside of the SIH who are already requiring such a ground station. So we're fast tracking that development a little bit. On the GNSS side, on the SPAS system, SANZA is also participating in the aviation sector's CNS strategy, the communication, navigation, and surveillance strategy, where we are collaborating with ATNS. So they are developing the new strategy for the Department of Transport, and a large part of that is also addressing the augmented or the GNSS systems. From that, there's been some new development in terms of collaboration with the rest of the world, and where there is an opportunity for us to collaborate with Europe in the ECNOS V3, and for us to be able to get a more capable system by collaborating with them for similar or even less expenditure on our side. So ultimately delivering on our business case for the region, not just South Africa. So in that sense, we're also updating the business case. So on the data visualization center, there's already some procurement going on, and so there's good progress, physical progress on that part. On the Earth observation side, so we're working very hard on the user requirement. As you saw in the early slide, the user requirement is one of the enabling blocks towards the space segment. So Earth observation is working very hard, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So they are currently doing the appointment of a service provider to coordinate the user requirement process. Okay, and towards the space segment, so we are establishing the project management office in SANZA, and Val will later on talk a little bit more about the concurrent design facility. Next slide, please. So this is the requirement from Infrastructure of South Africa. So those are the different types of plans that we are required to deliver. So as I said, with the GUL from GTAC, we can expect good progress on both the feasibility and financial plans going forward. The procurement operational plans 3 to about 7. Well, basically all of the rest is currently being addressed in the project management plan, and there has been some significant progress on that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just a very quick high-level look at the work breakdown structure for the space system. So this is just to give you a sense of the progress that's being made in terms of the project management plan. So this is at the highest level. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick schedule. The main thing to realize here is that all of the planning tasks 3 to 9 on this are all sort of scheduled for completion towards the end of this year. So we hope to deliver an approved business case by the end of this year, which would hopefully ultimately result in funding through investors in the blended finance model. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the requirements process, this is also an extract from the project management plan. We have requirements both from Earth observation and space science. We go into the SIH requirements, which ultimately leads to a mission system specification, which would lead then to the space segment, both in terms of the launch elements, the base bus element, and the payload systems. And then from this requirement will also stem the ground system requirement. The reason why we can fast track the ground systems a little bit is that it's all based on standards, and there should be no discrepancy between what we're trying to implement at Fontaine and what would ultimately be required by the space system. Next slide, please. Okay, just my final slide, just to give you a quick idea of the high-level breakdown on the EO side. So currently they're working towards the icons number 1, 2, and 3, which is the observation requirements, the informing studies, and the industry engagement. So that is what I was referring to earlier in terms of the requirements process for Earth observation. So anyway, so that is quickly a quick update on the current status of the SIH. So so I will deal with any questions. So once again, apologies for sound. It was difficult for me to be understood. Hopefully the slides provided some additional clarity. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Eugene. And apologies, colleagues, for the sound quality. So that was just to give you an update as to what has been happening on the back end regarding the Space Infrastructure Hub. So there's 2 elements, as Eugene touched on. So there's an SIH leadership team inside of SANZA, which Eugene is leading. So he's essentially presented some of the work at a very high level. But the second element that Eugene touched on is the need for a bankable feasibility study. So in order to be able to secure the investor funding, we have to put on the table a bankable feasibility study. And this is not normal to public entities like SANZA. And this is the first instance where we actually going out and looking for investor funding. And so the bankable feasibility study is something that's new to us. So we've actually, as Eugene indicated, we've contracted GTAC from National Treasury to assist us on putting that study together. But that'll also draw on a lot of the work that Eugene and his team has been doing. So I'm going to speak around the co-creation of the ecosystem, which is essentially some of the viewpoints is from consultations between ourselves and ZARSpace Inc. We've had workshops. We normally have a standing fortnightly meeting just to exchange ideas in terms of how we can move forward on a number of different fronts. So the key departure point for those conversations is this aspect of co-creation of this ecosystem. But just to get into yes. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. You were just hitting your stride there. Can I suggest we just pause on that, on Eugene's feedback for a second?
Sure.
And just test if members of the audience want to ask any specific questions around the SIH update. My quick, the biggest take from there is GTAC appointment has been confirmed. Is that something that from National Treasury is now a box we can now tick?
Yes,
that's correct. Sorry about it. No, yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I think that's the first one. And then I think related to that was the timeline, the Gantt chart that Eugene showed to us. I'm assuming there's a period now of contracting, or what happens from a GTAC SANZA point of view? Is there time in that plan for agreeing the contract between the entities, or how does it work?
Sorry, if I can come in. So the contracting is essentially completed. We are doing the signature, so we are ready to kick off and start the work. So yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. Great. I think those were the two that stood out for me. Can I just check with the attendees? There are a few comments. There are copies of the slides needed. I think some of that could be made available. We'll take SANZA's direction on what can be shared, but I'm assuming that if you're sharing it with this audience, we could make those available. Well,
yes, we'll certainly make that available to you.
All right.
Okay. Yeah.
Are there any other points of clarity or questions that the attendees would like to direct to Val or Eugene around this first section? And then we can move on to the next one.
Well, I see some questions in the Q&A section.
Oh, the Q&A.
I'll answer some there by text. Thanks.
Yes, somebody's asking for some acronym qualifications. There is a question. Eugene is answering on the Q&A. All right, very good. Thank you, Eugene. All right, Val, thank you. Sorry for that interruption, but I think you can proceed. And if there are more Q&As, we can just post them on that chat. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Kamal, for that. So I'll proceed. Just in terms of the co-creation, we've seen this time and time and again, and I think this is something that SANZA is essentially recalibrating itself in terms of what is its role and responsibilities vis-a-vis the local industry. And I know this has been a very sensitive point, and we've heard many comments to the effect that SANZA is actually competing with the industry. And I want to actually deal with that myth. Okay. So first of all, when we're starting off with a space program, we have to understand and appreciate that in many instances, when you're looking at it from a political perspective, there's not always that lack of understanding and appreciation of what space science can do, or space applications, products, and services can actually do or deliver in terms of benefits. And it's therefore incumbent upon us to actually get our political principles apprised in terms of what that value proposition is. But once we've done that, essentially, and convinced our political principles, the second element, which is the second aspect of the slide, is sometimes when we're starting off, you look at an inappropriate or an unsustainable approach going forward. And I think this is where we're now starting to reconfigure SANZA in a way, because if you actually think about what's happening in the public space, public entity space, it's becoming wholly unsustainable. And the reason for that is there's huge budget cuts because of the fiscus in terms of pressures of COVID, the economic climate, and some of the recent unrest and so on. Consistent budget cuts on the public entities. So what we've done, and we've realized this actually in 2017 already, and we embarked on a growth path essentially to go and look for additional funding for most of the growth opportunities that we were looking at. So getting the approach right is very, very critical. But the other thing I need to also put on the table, sometimes if you start on the wrong foot and you implement along that line, it takes a lot of effort to undo it and to refocus and redirect the organization. And I think in this instance, because of the climate and the environment that has been changing from a sustainability and from a mandate point of view, we had to relook at how we're going to be operating going forward, especially in that fiscal climate. So what we've also been sensitive to, if we looked at our mandate, the Act is very clear. The Act does not in any way suggest that SANZA should be implementing all of the space initiatives in-house. In fact, the Act is clear that SANZA is mandated to develop and support the local industry. And so the success of the local industry is going to be the success of SANZA. And that's the one key departure point that I wanted to put on the table. So in effect, what we are looking at is an ecosystem approach. So you have SANZA, which has been given the mandate, but it has to operate in this ecosystem. And I'm going to explain what this ecosystem looks like and what the building blocks and the elements of this ecosystem looks like. But in essence, what we are advocating for is a more collective approach rather than seeing SANZA as it being in one corner and the rest of the players sort of trying to find meaning and expression in terms of what SANZA is doing. So in this particular slide, it's about getting the government and government entities like SANZA working together and closely with the industry and working with society. So that collective approach is essentially taking all of the stakeholders into account rather than just SANZA standing out alone. So some of the conversations we're having inside of SANZA is not about just SANZA, it's about an ecosystem approach. And you'll see that coming through very strongly in the presentation. So when we talk about an ecosystem, the departure point in terms of the value proposition for the whole space sector is obviously on the downstream, the products and services. That's where you extract the maximum value. Okay. So being able to deliver on those products and services, whether it's Earth observation or telecommunications or navigation, positioning and timing, or even space exploration for that matter. That's the thematic areas, and that's where the real benefit as to why we're engaging in the space sector actually accrues. But in order to be able to deliver on the products and services, you need a whole suite of interventions to give effect to those products and services. So we need the human capital interventions. You need the warm bodies to actually work in the ecosystem. You need the industry and the industry support to make all of this a reality, whether it's upstream, building of satellites, design, manufacturing, exporting of technologies, and midstream where the actual operations start to happen, or even downstream where the products and services actually get developed. And then to make all of this, enable all of this to happen, you need the requisite infrastructure. And Eugene kind of pointed that space value chain where you looked at different segments of the infrastructure as well. And then obviously international partnerships. We have to take into account that the space sector is global in nature, and we're talking about a global supply chain. So those international partnerships become very, very key for us. So those are the kinds of building blocks. And these are the kinds of things that SANZA is currently focusing on to give effect to this ecosystem. The functional activity is essentially what we will be engaging on a day-to-day basis. And that's essentially the core between the building blocks and the functional activities and the thematic areas is where the industry now needs to come and focus on. So we look at mission. So Eugene is starting to talk about the mission requirements using, starting from the user requirements, what sort of platforms do we need, satellite platforms, ground segments, data segments, and so on. And in order to give effect to that as well, there might be instances where we'll have to engage in R&D, enabling technologies. We do a lot of research and development in the ecosystem. So how do you capture all of that? How do you take that IP and put it into the commercial domain? But more importantly, how do you use that R&D into the mission itself? And then when the missions are up in orbit, you need the mission operations and the ground segments, the antennas that speak to it. And then on the latter end is the space applications. So development of those products and services to meet the end user requirements is very critical. On this side, in terms of what's encasing this entire ecosystem, we have space law and policy. So the ecosystem that we are working on is very regulated because of dual use technologies. And we have the Space Council and the DTIC that's overlooking in terms of the regulatory aspects, the licensing aspects, and so on. So we have to take that into cognizance. But there's also some policy principles that we have to adhere to. So there's the National Space Policy, and it has a number of principles and objectives that speaks to this ecosystem in effect. But at the bottom end, and this is where SANZA comes in, as the implementing agency and to give effect to this ecosystem, we have to make sure that the strategy in terms of the direction that we want to journey is actually right for what we're trying to achieve. And the business model, which is what I will talk about, once you have a strategy put on the table, we then have to reflect, so what is the business model of the agency looking like? And the business model has to take into account the broader ecosystem requirements, not just the organizational requirements, but the ecosystem requirements. And that obviously then dictates even the macro structure of the organization. And I'll talk a little bit about it in very high level and give you a sense of what's on the table. But I thought also, when we're talking about co-creation, there's an aspect that needs to be looked at in terms of the philosophy that embodies the co-creation concept that we're talking about. You know, very often in this industry sector, and we've seen this time and time and again, there's this notion of a zero-sum game. There's one winner and one loser. So somebody has to win, and in that instance, there's a loser as well. But we are saying that that's not the game we want to play. It's not a zero-sum game. What we do want to play is the multi-sum game, where everybody wins. And if we don't win as a collective, then we all lose. And we've seen this time and time and again, where there's elbowing in the industry, there's tensions. And I just want to caution, those kind of tensions work against us achieving that multi-sum game. Okay, so very often we want to put opportunities on the table and make sure there's a level playing field where everybody has the same opportunity to respond and engage. We've seen many instances, for example, where industry players will approach SANZA directly, and we've shunned away from entertaining that, because when we put out tenders and if we have conversations with specific industry players and they land up with these kind of contracts, it becomes very problematic in the public space, especially trying to explain how certain institutes or entities actually won these tenders. And you see that playing out in the public space in terms of fraud, the Zondo Commission and so on. So we're trying to keep this as clean as possible and create that equal, the level playing field for all industry players, and including small and medium enterprises and new entrants coming into the sector as well. What we thought was also important in this conversation is to put together a set of values that we think is going to be very important in the co-creation. When I started off at SANZA, you know, we had this saying that it's mission driven. So you look at the missions of the organization, and so you've got these different initiatives that you want to push through. So it's mission driven, values led. So you define your missions, and your values then pulls those missions into implementation or reality. Actually, we flipped that completely around. We now, even inside of SANZA, we're having the conversation about values-driven, mission-led. So the departure point is having a common set of values that's going to drive us into the same direction, and it's the missions then that actually gets extracted out and implemented. So it's just flipping it on its head, but more from a values approach as opposed to just a mission approach. So the core, I'm not going to just focus in detail, but high level respect, trust, and dignity. We need to ensure there's excellence, quality, and performance. We don't want to get into contracting arrangements and then find out that some of our service providers are unable to deliver. That then has a reputational risk on SANZA and the ability to attract more funding, which then has a knock-on effect onto the entire ecosystem. So we want to make sure there's a level of excellence, a level of responsibility, accountability, and a commitment. Teamwork, we want to see collaboration and cooperation. When SANZA goes out into the international, and we'll present some opportunities at the end, international engagements, we want to showcase ZAR Space Inc., the South African industry, not specific industry players, but the industry as a collective. And that's very important, and that the only way we can do that is there is a level of collaboration and cooperation. Innovation as well, creativity and ingenuity. We as SANZA are not advocating that we know all the answers to all the questions that might be posed. And that's the value of the co-creation, that in these kinds of conversations that we're having between ourselves and ZAR Space Inc., there might be some ideas or innovative ideas in the industry that we haven't thought about, that if you put it on the table and if we work collectively on those kind of ideas, will give us a somewhat different traction and different results. And that leads to the achievement. We want to make sure there's results and successes as quickly as possible and as early as possible, so that we can keep that investment portfolio rolling in terms of the order book going forward. And then obviously fairness, diversity, inclusiveness, that talks of the transformation issue that we'll come to just now. I want to also, in having that conversation around co-creation, and Intosh will come through just now, we have to navigate a new future for the space ecosystem, let's put it that way. So we know what the current reality looks like, and we've had a lot of constraints, a lot of issues in terms of company survival, sustainability, and so on. So we understand the current reality, and it's taken us some time to get even the SANZA house in order, and now to pull through the growth opportunities, and I'll show that just now. But we need to move ourselves towards what is our shared vision. And I talk about shared vision, not a SANZA vision, shared vision between SANZA and the industry. And if we can juxtapose the current reality with a shared vision, then we can do a proper gap analysis in terms of what are those things that we need to do as a collective. And from that, we can define detailed roadmap in terms of how we want to move forward. So that's a methodology we want to use in a lot of framing of these interventions that we're looking at. And Intosh will talk about a few of those as well. And so very high level for all of the initiatives that we want to embark on together with the industry players is understanding that current reality. We're also looking at how do we audit the local landscape? How do we know what exactly exists in the local landscape? And we need to understand that to get a sense as to how we maneuver, even on the roadmap perspective. What does a global space market looks like? Can we draw down from some of those learnings and bring that into our ecosystem? So that current reality needs to be properly framed before we can move on to the other elements. Then that leaves us with a shared vision. We need to look at what the strategic context is, what the user requirements assessment, because ultimately the success of the space program is on the user requirements. Over and above that, obviously, we're looking at maybe on upstream exports, in terms of leveraging on the developments on the upstream and how we can export a lot of those technologies. So obviously there's a value proposition on that side as well. And then the gap analysis, you do the full analysis, understanding the critical success factors, detailed roadmaps, operational requirements, and roadmaps itself. Okay, that's essentially the way we want to look at a number of these interventions. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll come back at the end, because I think this is an area where Intosh can come in on the strategic aspects of what ZAR Space Inc. has done and how that intersects with what SANZA is doing at the moment. So I'm going to just pause there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. There is a question that's been posed to you around multi-sum on the question, the Q&A part of the chat.
Yeah.
Do you want to have a look at that maybe before we hand over to Intosh?
So Shafiq is asking, how are we going to achieve the multi-sum when you only have limited projects competing for them, right? And okay, let me take an example of, let's say, the upstream. We foresee, for example, normally you will have a prime contractor, but we're going to impose some level of policy constraints even on the prime contractor to say, well, look, if you want to qualify as a prime contractor, you have to ensure that there's a level of subcontracting to the broad industry. So it's not that the lion's share of these projects or even the financial flow is going to go through to the prime contractor. We're going to make sure there's transformative elements, there's new small, medium enterprises coming in. So those policy prescripts is something that we are currently working on as well. So we want to make sure that the broader ecosystem actually benefits as opposed to just one or two players. And those are the kinds of interventions we are looking at. So even if we look at it from a value chain perspective, R&D, we think the whole sort of concept of centers of competence, for example, we know, for example, in South Africa, there's a very strong optronics, sector in South Africa. So how do we build up a center of competence where a number of the key players are engaged in R&D to develop specific technology platforms and let's say there's 5 or 10 different players in that consortium working towards this. You get an IP arrangements, there's royalty frameworks, there's a commercial framework. So whoever then goes and exploits that IP, obviously everybody in the system generates. So there's a lot of models that we need to look at. And as I said, we don't have all the answers. This is why we're calling it a co-creation initiative. It's a conversation between us and the industry through ZARSpace Inc. to crystallize some of those opportunities and how we can move forward.
As well, I think that's very useful. This idea of the prime contractor being mandated or requested to subcontract percentages of work, etc. I mean, that's worked in other sectors.
Yes.
ICT sector, in the automotive sector. So it's something that it doesn't have to be reinvented. There's some really good precedents in other industries that have transformed significantly beyond where the space sector has transformed. So there's some very good learnings. I see there are 2 other questions that have popped up on the Q&A chats. Do you want to handle that now? Do you want to have a look and handle that now?
I can do that. SIH to service delivery on a municipal level. I think, Lisette, that's exactly what we're trying to achieve as well. There's the district delivery model. In fact, the value chain that Eugene put up at the very end, we're looking at outcomes. In fact, when we put the proposal together, one of the key leverage points was on the district delivery model. How do we push the products and services at a national, provincial, and then local municipal level as well? And so that value chain must at some point in time lead to the municipal level as well. And there's also another aspect that we have not been used to, and that's pushing products and services into the private sector, because there is a demand from the banking sector, from the insurance sector, construction sector, and so on, for using satellite data and so on. SANZA's strategic plan on aligning with other foreign space agencies and creating projects that benefits both countries. And yeah, I think that's a very important aspect. So if you look at our strategic plan, the 5th strategic objectives talk about national partnerships, so working in the national system of innovation with our sister agencies. And then the second level is on the region, trying to position what South Africa has in terms of with respect to the continent. There's a lot of things that we're doing that's very unique on the continent, and we think positioning that also opens up a lot of opportunities, growth opportunities. And then also internationally, there's a lot of international agencies wanting to work with SANZA so that we can, obviously they're looking for opportunities, and we're also looking for the same kind of opportunities. So we're continuously having that and trying to identify those opportunities. But we'll talk about some of these things going forward.
Yes, I agree. And I think if I can add to Bel's question, answer to that last question, is what we've started doing as ZARSpace is where SANZA has strategic MOUs or partnerships with other agencies, we're looking to connect, as ZARSpace, connect the industries of those countries to each other. Most recently, we hosted an industry-to-industry event with Brazil on the back of the MOU that SANZA had signed with the Brazilian Space Agency. And we're looking to replicate that. So please, if you're interested and keen to participate in those events, it would be phenomenal to replicate the SANZA agency political intergovernment level collaborations into industry and partnership opportunities. Well, I'm also checking the time. So I know there's one additional question that's popped up there. I don't see it now. I think it might be on the chat group.
Oh, I think it was a mild response.
Oh, it went onto the chat group, yes. If a company has some product or software and another is still trying to develop this, how can we ensure the supplier gets a chance to submit services? Do you want to just share a view on that, Phil?
Yeah. So, Kamal, there's some interventions that is coming through at the moment, sorry, unfortunately, Andiswa was not able to make this meeting because she's actually engaging a team on the SIH right now as we speak on the financial aspects as well. but she would have been most appropriate to answer this. But what we've started to do, we've started now, I think there's a call that's just gone out, for example, where we're looking at putting out calls for projects on the downstream. So we're working with the National Research Foundation because they are a funding instrument agency, as opposed to duplicating the administrative system, we're just using their system. And so we're starting out to put calls for proposals where we now have funding from the DSI, the Department of Science and Innovation. So initially, I think the next few years is about 60 million Rand. But once the Space Infrastructure Hub funding comes through, a significant part of that funding will be thrown into the downstream to say, do you have products or services, or do you think you can build products and services that can respond to the user requirements? And I think what we will do is put out a listing of what those user requirements look like, and then the industry can respond to those requirements. And so if you have something that is in your pipeline or already on the shelf, it will be useful just to respond to that as well. So we'll create those opportunities and level playing fields in terms of funding.
Very good. I think the 90 somewhat people on this call have written that down. So we can
Okay.
very good question, and I think very good answer as well. I like the essence of this section around joint accountability between the industry and SANZA to ensure the growth and sustainability of the sector. I think that's important. You know, from our perspective, Val, I know we've spoken about this a lot, is the core design principle has got to be that when SANZA, as the implementation agency, as a recipient of the funds for SIH at this stage and other projects, when those projects and interventions are being designed, industry's participation needs to be designed in by default. You know, that's the biggest swing that I think we need to achieve through this process, is to get industry's participation designed in by default and not as an afterthought. You know, that's the big plus. And if we're doing that right, and if we're collaborating around that transparently, obviously notwithstanding the procurement supply chain cautions that you mentioned earlier, then I think everyone stands to benefit from that.
Exactly.
So so I'm going to suggest we move on to the next section so that we give Ntosh sufficient time to cover it. Val, if you're okay with that.
I'm fine, Kamal. So I'm going to ask Ntosh to come in. Ntosh.
Many thanks, Kamal, and many thanks, Val. I was trying to switch on my camera briefly so that I can say hi, so people can at least see my face for a few seconds. Hello, I hope you can all see me. I'm going to switch that off for now. It is great to be connecting with you all this afternoon. I thought it was important really to give a bit of a context to understand literally how we actually got to this point. So firstly, what we did was basically to look at having a problem statement, really defining what the problem statement would be. And this basically is sort of what's going to answer the big question in terms of what exactly are those issues that we're trying to resolve? What are those key issues that we're trying to address? And then if I could ask you to just move forward. And then in terms of doing that, we would then need to move on to the next level, which is about really unpacking that problem statement. And in the process of really unpacking that problem statement, it'll take us to the next and final phase, which basically is where we could hopefully then be able to come up with a shared vision that we can clearly articulate. And I think, as Val mentioned earlier on, this is something that we would have. It's basically not a SANZA vision, but this would be a shared vision by all of us. Now, next slide, please. Now, firstly, we went through an exercise with ZAR Space Inc., where we actually came up with the following problem statement. This is basically something that we saw as the two organizations coming together to say, what are the sort of those big challenges that this sector is facing? Now, in terms of doing that, we then looked at how do we move from where we are, rather, how do we move from this current problem statement, and what are those key themes or key trends or key words even that stand out of this problem statement that could really sort of be the key drivers of what we're trying to do. And that is where we are. So if you look currently, there are some sort of key words that stand out. most of them you will notice that are somewhat, have a negative connotation. For example, we realize that obviously the local space sector has stagnated with limited support. And then this is a sector which has not historically received targeted government support. And from a financial sustainability, we find that the industry is precarious, and then there is actually limited local beneficiation due to reliance on international data vendors and inadequate access. So again, out of that problem statement, you can clearly see these are sort of the if you like, the negative messages that came out of it. Now we looked at how do we then take the problem statement as it is, and in terms of looking at where we want to be in the future, where we actually would like us to be. So if you look at the future state, that very same problem statement, this is sort of where we see ourselves in the future. This is where we're in a place where now the local space sector, is significant, with strong support from not just SANZA, but other government institutions as well. And the downstream is actually now receiving targeted government support. And from a financial sustainability perspective, the industry at this point is robust, and then there's powerful local beneficiation. Again, that very same problem statement that we identified, looking at how do we turn that, if you like, how do we invert that and turn it into the positive? And this would sort of be that vision, that shared vision where we would all want to be. Next slide, please. So what I also did, looking at the industry report that came out. So, but basically what I did was I undertook an exercise whereby I looked at each of the 7 recommendations that came out, and then I actually clustered, all of the little fine details under each of those recommendations into different themes or different streams, if you like. So perhaps to sort of aid you a little bit in terms of reading the table as it is. So you've got the recommendations on your left-hand side, really running vertically from the first one to the 7th one, and then the streams running horizontally across the screen. So what I did basically, for example, if you look at recommendation number 1, how SANZA can help boost local beneficiation. So out of looking at that entire recommendation as it is alone, there were about 5 intersections with the different themes that I picked out. So you can see there was an intersection with the point about SMMEs, and there was an intersection with regards to the issue of transformation. And in terms of partnerships and collaboration, there were at least about 10 different points and different facts in that recommendation that really made reference to the point of partnerships and collaboration. So that obviously is a very, very big one. And of course, there's on investment and funding, as well as regulatory and policy issues. So that's basically how I came out with this clustering of these recommendations, in order to really, club these together into these streams that we can actually drive forward in terms of, working together between ourselves as well as with ZA Space Inc. to really respond, as it were, to all of the key issues that were highlighted out of that report. Next slide, please. Now, if we take those 8 streams that I highlighted, perhaps let me quickly, this is the stream mapping that Vel actually showed you earlier on, looking at basically the current reality and what is that shared vision that we would like to get to. But in terms of us really moving from the current reality to where we would like to be, we'd obviously need to do a gap analysis, and also obviously a detailed mapping of how we actually get to achieve all of that. Now, if we take the 8 streams from the clustering exercise, and we actually overlay them in terms of this particular mapping, you will see, in order for us to really understand our current reality, we would have to do an audit of the sector itself. And really we need to, in terms of understanding the gaps, that is the point with regards that was made. And that these 2 really came out quite strongly with regards to SMMEs, new entrants, as well as the transformation agenda. And then in terms of detailed mapping, there were quite a number of issues that came out with regards to local beneficiation, public-private IP partnerships. And then under the shared vision, this is where sort of these are the things that I think we all would like to see happen. So these were the ones that really stood out in terms of having an export-ready sector, be financially sustainable, as well as the Pan-African agenda, as I mentioned. So these were sort of the things that when I looked at all the clustering and how these would overlay over this mapping of where we are versus where we would like to be, and how actually, what is the roadmap that we can actually follow in order to get us to that point. Next slide, please. And the other point I thought to bring out quite clearly was really to look at how the various points that came out of that report, how those actually find resonance with our, our 2020 to 2025 strategic plan. And these were sort of the 5 key points that I pulled out. And this is how these really align with where SANZA is going, or rather where SANZA is really strategically focused for the next 5 years. So in terms of being more commercially focused, as mentioned, we are re-looking at our business model as SANZA to be more commercially driven for our, not just our long-term sustainability, but I think partly also for the industry, whilst we obviously maintain our mandate to do public good. And of course, skills development is a major point that came out. So we're really looking at how we're going to support the development of critical mass of skills, not just for us as an organization, but for the industry, and as well as obviously there will be local as well as regional space initiatives that would benefit from that. And transformation really was about looking at not only just the transformation of the sector itself, but really looking at the development, growth, as well as transforming the space industry that, to make it more responsive to local needs, as well as to position it globally. I know there was a point made about opportunities that can be leveraged both across the African continent and globally. So that's where the transformation element talks to as well. Now, collaboration and partnerships, this is another one, as I mentioned, in terms of that clustering. This one came out quite strongly. So it's about really looking at how we're going to foster those strategic partnerships. And I think somebody did ask a question earlier on with regards to how are we going to leverage partnerships for the benefit of the sector. So that actually talks directly to that. And in fact, there will be another slide later on that actually talks to some of those, if I can call them, immediate opportunities for the industry to really come along as a result of these strategic partnerships that we have globally. And then the other point is with regards to Africa opportunities. Of course, now our Africa focus agenda really provides many growth opportunities, not just for us as an organization, but of course for the local industry as well. Next slide, please. Now, from a strategic prioritization point of view, we have already started developing, the skills development strategy, as well as the industry development strategy, and we will soon also be starting with the Africa engagement strategy. Now, if you look at each one of these strategies that we are currently focusing on, each one of them, if you put them into that stream mapping that looks at the current reality, where we want to be, how we're going to get there, as well as the detailed mapping of it. So what this does, basically, you can really tease out of that mapping elements of skills development. There's definitely, industry development that's required there. And of course, our vision and our focus to really be more involved and play a bigger role across the African continent. So in a nutshell, that's basically my presentation. I want to just quickly thank you for your time, and I would welcome any questions either right now or at the end, or even sometime during the presentation. Thank you very much, Kamal, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Santosh. I see there has been Shafiq has posed a question on the question group. Do you want to, or the question chat? Do you want to have a look at that, or I can read it to you?
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
Yeah. So actually, it is in our strat plan. If you read our strategic plan, it's on the web, on our website. There's 5 strategic objectives. Objective 1 is products and services. Objective 2 is on infrastructure. And what I wanted to also pinpoint is, and I started earlier in the conversation in terms of roles and responsibilities, and you'll see that coming out just now as well. SANZA's role is about putting the core infrastructure, embedding that down from a national perspective. And that core infrastructure will be used as a basis to bring the industry upstream and downstream. So effectively, for example, when you're looking at downstream, we're not expecting the local industry to go and build its own, let's say, IT infrastructure, but to come and actually use the infrastructure that's been put in place by SANZA, build the products and services in the system. So we're looking at more sort of cloud-based solutions as opposed to our servers and so on. So industry comes in, uses the infrastructure, builds the products and services. Obviously, we'll have a commercial framework in terms of how they get compensated for the work that they're doing. So in effect, this is exactly talking. So we haven't unpacked the strategic plan itself. It's on the web, so you can have a look at it. But it is in there. It's not omitted. Thanks, Kamal.
Thanks very much, Val and Ntosh. Open for any further questions from Ntosh. And Ntosh, thanks for taking the time to link those actions to the report. I guess the main thing now is to build in the mechanism to share continuous updates against those interventions, so that the report itself is not, it's not tangential to the SIH itself, right? So we'll have to. When we do our progress updates, it would include those actions against the plan as well. So if there are no further, there's a new question from the SIH. Shall SANZA be looking into participating in the US Artemis and Chinese space station program?
So maybe to answer that question, so when Eugene spoke about the ground segment at Maikesfontein, the initial reason why we were looking at that was more from a deep space network to support the Lunar and the Mars missions. And there's been a lot of work with the NASA team around that. It was just unfortunate because as we were drawing to a conclusion, there was a political transition, which kind of delayed this decision as well. And COVID obviously didn't assist us. So from the US perspective, yes, we are looking at that particular participation. The second, on the Chinese space station program, obviously we're part of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So there's already a collaboration, as I will come through at the end. There is a BRICS initiative that we've already starting to engage on. And inside of that framework, we're looking at different collaborative mechanisms and opportunities. So even there, we will explore what those possibilities look like as well. But obviously, saying that, you can understand the political tension between the US and China. So even that has to be navigated very carefully in terms of where does South Africa stand. From our perspective, we're fairly neutral, and so there's no political aspects or agendas from our side. But that's something we'll have to watch. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Val. I think we can move on into the last section on your deck, the update on SANZA.
Yeah. So just to give you a flavor as to where SANZA is moving for the next 5 years in terms of our strategic plan, you'll notice that our vision is Africa-centric. It's now moved away from just focusing on South Africa to now looking at Africa. And we've got a 2035 timeframe in terms of how we're going to respond to the various policy interventions. So there's the SDGs 2030, even the National Development Plan extends to 2030. There's the Agenda 2063, which moves in 10-year chunks. So there's a lot of policy perspectives that we're latching onto in terms of looking at it from a 2030 perspective. But the key aspect is around the socioeconomic, environmental challenges on the African continent. And the reason why we're focusing on Africa, there's been some momentum towards setting up an African space program. And the African space policy is very clear. Do not go and duplicate infrastructure where it already exists, even within existing national space program. So how do we take the unique value proposition that we already have in South Africa and position that for the African continent? And how do we grow that and make that more substantive than what it currently looks like? So that's our vision, to grow that pipeline, reposition and grow that pipeline. The second aspect is in terms of our mission. And that's to provide leadership in unlocking this benefit. Okay. You'll notice that the word leadership is the operative word in this mission statement. It's not saying that SANZA is going to implement the initiative. So the leadership aspect is even coming back to this conversation around co-creation. How do we, as SANZA, embrace that whole philosophy of co-creation? And that's a leadership aspect. So it's about providing leadership and opportunities for the entire sector, rather than just for ourselves. So we're looking at it from an ecosystem perspective. One of the key questions that we had to ask when we were navigating from the last 5 years into the new 5-year term, in terms of the strategic focus, is what exactly do we need to change? Do SANZA continue as business as usual, or is there some level of change that needs to happen within the organization? The departure point for answering that question is that irrespective of how we look at change in the organization or in the ecosystem, we have to make sure that the mandate that has been given to SANZA and to the ecosystem, that still needs to be maintained and achieved. The second issue is, as much as we want to achieve the mandate, and given the current financial constraints, how do we ensure the sustainability of the sector? Now, when we use the word our, it's our as per the ecosystem, not as per just SANZA itself. So we need to ensure the long-term sustainability of the ecosystem. So those are the two key driving hooks in terms of how we navigate going forward. Now, if you looked at where SANZA was 2 years ago, our parliamentary grant was roughly sitting at 150 million rand. Now, if you had to ask the question, is that what it takes to run a space program? Actually, that's a far cry from what you need for a viable, sustainable space program. In fact, when we did the analysis, when we were putting the space strategy together, around about 2017, we thought, if you go back and read the strategy, that South Africa would actually need a space budget of around 2.3 billion. Compare 2.3 billion with 150 million. So that was not going to cut it in terms of sustainability and all of the good intentions that we've just expressed already. So we started to go out and actively look for those growth potentials. And so currently where we're sitting, our budget is looking more like 350 million rands per annum. Okay. But if you fast forward over the next 2 years, that future spend, or that tree, that growth tree, looks more like plus or 18, minus 18 billion rands. And just to unpack what that pipeline looks like, one of the things that we are working on is a telecommunications satellite, and I'll speak about that just now. We're looking at a data cube initiative for South Africa. There is going to be some sort of announcement on the Africa data cube at some point in time. So I'll still keep an eye on that. We also have looking at teleports. So already we've putting together, installing about 20 different antenna systems on the ground to speak to the mega constellations. That's going to be looking at internet access, so global internet access. We current design facility, the deep space network, it's still on the cards. It hasn't fallen off yet. That's going to be about a 3 odd billion rand initiative. The ground segment, which links to the deep space network, and also future South African missions. So we're going to use that ground segment for future missions as well, because our current ground segment is becoming quite constrained in terms of now becoming quite crowded. We spoke about the data visualization, which we'll touch upon. There's also a new building that we're looking at, which will be more or less up and running by March 2023. So we're just doing the space planning for that. So that building will also include a number of facilities, laboratories, and so on for even the industry engagement. We already have funding for the OTEC upgrade. It's just the ownership issue. It's more about ensuring that the ownership of the transfer happens before we can start the upgrade. And then we also have a Space Weather Center initiative, which I'll talk about just now. And then a Space Infrastructure Hub, which is the big one that Eugene alluded to, which is about 4.47 billion rands. Okay. There's one initiative that's not on this. It's something that's new. And that's essentially the DSI has been looking at launch capabilities. They've done 2 studies. And ultimately, that could be looking at another 4 billion rand investment into the system. That's still early stages, but there is a intent to look at that very closely. So if you put all of these together, that pipeline looks around 18 billion plus or minus. Okay. Just to give you a flavor as to where we are on some of these initiatives, on the bottom end of this picture is a architect's viewpoint around the new Space Weather Center. And this is going to provide space weather information to the aviation sector. So all flights in and out of Africa would require space weather information. This is a regulated requirement, by the way, from the International Civil Aviation Organization. So before a pilot takes off, they have to incorporate space weather as part of the flight plan. And that information in Africa is going to come from this particular center. Okay. So the top end is just, I think that picture was taken on Friday last week. So there's a quite significant movement. The minister launched this on the 9th of March. So as of last week, that's what you're looking at on the ground. Okay. And we're hoping that before the end of this year, by around about October, that will be, the roof level would be completed on this building. And we'll start to then move in and start to put the infrastructure in place. Again, there's huge opportunities. We're seeing a number of student initiatives. In fact, right now, we've got a new research chair that's looking at solar physics. So this is also products and services coming from the center, which is paid for by the aviation sector. Also, the marine sector will come in, mining sector, and all of that. Different sectors will be looking at using this particular data or data coming from this particular center. We've Digital Earth South Africa, we just put I think about 2 years ago, the first installation of a high performance computing platform. I think that's just over 2 petabytes. And that's trying to incorporate all of the satellite data that's archived within SANZA, dating back to the 1970s. So we've been producing mosaics over the country from the 1980s onwards, using the spot image or the spot satellite data. And what we are planning to do is to also look at a data visualization center, which will sort of feed into the concurrent design facility, which I'll talk about next. So obviously that high performance computing platform is scalable, but obviously we're looking at hybrid solutions. So we look at some sort of infrastructure within SANZA, but the rest will obviously be sort of outsourced, more cloud sort of computing as well. And that hybrid model will essentially dictate what the delivery would look like in terms of industry coming in on the downstream, going into a system like this, massaging the data, producing the products and services, which the end users can then use. So we're trying to set up that ecosystem. So even the data visualization center, if you've got a product and service that you want to demonstrate to your end client, as opposed to doing that on your laptop, you then come into the data visualization center, demonstrate that to your client. Much bigger impact than trying to do that on your laptop. So these are the kinds of interventions that we're looking at more from a marketing commercialization point of view. Okay. The concurrent design facility that I've been speaking about. So on the top end, this was a visit to the European Space Agency at ESTAC in Netherlands. And that's the concurrent design facility on the back there. And the founder of that is the guy in the middle. So you'll see a picture of the ESA, the European Space Agency concurrent design facility. So at the moment, we're looking at emulating that. We've got a bilateral arrangement with ESA. And so we've used that partnership to emulate a concurrent design facility in South Africa. So we already have 25 million rand in the bank to put this into place. And we're going through the procurement phase at the moment. In fact, ESA has been assisting us in terms of speccing this system for us. And we've already started to train a number of our engineers at ESA or using this concurrent design facility. So the idea is that the industry, so even here on the upstream, SANZA is going to be responsible for very high system level engineering, okay? Level, say, 7, 8, 7, 6, and so on. But when you get to the lower levels of the engineering levels, that's when you're going to be subcontract. It's going to be subcontracted to the industry. So when you're looking at designing of the satellite, it's not just SANZA colleagues are going to be sitting in this room. I mean, SANZA will maintain the facility, but the industry, the engineers from the industry will come in, work alongside our SANZA engineers design the satellite on the fly. So the idea is that with this facility, we can do a design within a month, as opposed to the classical approach of doing this over 12 months or 14 months and so on. So we're going to reduce the time for design. And the good thing about this particular facility, it's not only used for the satellite segment, or the satellite platform. It can be used for any engineering design requirements. So we're going to make this more a sort of commercial sort of enterprise when we're not using it for designing satellites to the broader engineering industry. We're looking at 2 such facilities, one in Gauteng and one in the Western Cape. So even we understand there's a big contingency, especially in the upstream from the industry point of view, and they would find huge use for a facility like this down in the Western Cape as well. On the SATCOMs, we've done a lot of work on the strategy formulation. The strategy here, we're talking about a national strategy. And so SANZA kind of led this and facilitated the development of a national space strategy. So we've worked with DSI, DCDT, and CENTEC. And so in March this year, we concluded the work on a national telecom strategy. Where we are at the moment, so that's going through the approval process inside of DSI and DCDT. What we've done on the parallel end is worked with CENTEC and ourselves working with CENTEC to develop a telecoms business case. So there's an opportunity for us to now look at additional investor funding before the end of the year. And then that we're looking at about 5 or 6 billion rands, which forms part of the pipeline that we're looking at. Now, we think this is a very strong use case, especially if you look at what's actually leaving the country in terms of revenue, but also trying to deal with some of in fact, the 2 goals that we're trying to deliver on is innovative services through bridging this digital divide, especially rural economies and so on. And then we also want to achieve inclusive and sustained economic growth with a favorable balance of trade. So we want to make sure that as much of the revenue stays inside of the country. And the only way you can do that is by having your own satellite platform. So we're working with CENTEC on the back end. And there's 3 things I should mention from a SANZA perspective when we look at the telecom satellite. One is the acquisition management system engineering, where we would have high-level oversight. The second is on the operations aspect of the satellite itself. But the third aspect, which we thought was very important, is when we look at whether we have this capability to build a telecom satellite, we're not quite there yet. But we think even if we procure such a platform, even on the open market, it's going to be very important that we ensure local beneficiation happens so that there is some level of stimulation in the local industry when it comes to a telecom satellite. So that's something we're trying to figure out how we can best do that. But even this kind of conversation, Kamal, around co-creation might be useful to see what other possibilities working or having this conversation between SANZA, CENTEC, and the local industry. So that's happening. The strategy is going to be approved, and then we're looking at the funding for this particular initiative. Now, I didn't go through very much detail of the different kind of things because that we're doing in SANZA. I just gave you a high-level flavor of the kind of things that are being pulled through. But the key question is, what does this mean for SANZA itself? And that's where I want to land this particular conversation. Is, when you start to digest what we've just presented and a reframing and repositioning of how SANZA is going to look at itself vis-a-vis the local industry and supporting the local industry. There's all sorts of questions that can crop up. How do we do this? Why are we here? Why are we having this conversation now? What do we do going forward? And the one thing that we have to recognize, which is the departure point for this conversation, we recognize that the success of the local industry is going to be the success of SANZA. And in that vein, also responding to the end user requirements. So that is our key departure point from maybe the prior era where there was a thinking that all of the initiatives had to be implemented inside of SANZA. And that's a very key departure point. And I think this is why we're having this conversation around right now. What I also realized is that how we've been operating for the last 10 years, and by the way, SANZA celebrates its 10th anniversary this year. And what we realized, the last 10 years of operations is not necessarily going to help us or cut it in terms of where we're going to take this particular conversation. So just maintaining the status quo is not going to help us. We're going to fall off the cliff from a sustainability point of view because there's budget cuts on the cards for public entities. So doing more of the same is also not going to help us. So the technology has advanced, the industry has moved on. We need to ensure that we are all aligned and moving in the same direction. Resolving just the current issues that we're having inside of SANZA, in terms of what the current pipeline of infrastructure looks like, is not also not going to help us. So taking a more, progressive view in terms of what's actually required to make this work, in terms of the infrastructure, new technologies, fourth industrial revolution, those are the kinds of things that we need to embrace going forward. And then, as I said, we need to take our foot off the pedal in terms of just relying on the fiscus, on government purse to get us. And government realizes as well. There's a new model that's needed to make public entities sustainable. And then just operating as a public entity is also not going to cut it, but we rely on the fiscus. We have to make sure there's a commercial framing in terms of the value chain as well and the activities. So we recognize we need to move away from where SANZA has been operating and embrace a new state. And what's underpinning this conversation is that new strategy. So if you do get a chance to read that strategy, I will urge you to do that. There's some aspirational aspects in that strategy, which is what we're trying to implement. What we also recognize is we needed to have a new business model, a new approach, a new value chain, a new macro structure. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of that. We're still waiting for the approvals before we can make that known. But I can assure you that the new business model is trying to bring around more efficiencies and effectiveness in terms of what we're doing. It's also going to mean that we need to embrace a new culture. So even there, we started a culture change initiative inside of SANZA in terms of how do we embrace this new future? Because if we don't do that, we become unsustainable very quickly. So this is where we are inside of SANZA in terms of how we're framing and looking at going forward. So the new business model is taking a more space value chain approach, a more commercial focus. As I said, the organizational culture, we're looking at new set of values, changing the ethos, how the organization is used to working and working somewhat differently. So our ways of working needs to change as well. Rebranding, we already started this, repositioning the SANZA brand and creating the brand value. Now, this is very important because when we engaging at the international level, we are also trying to promote the South African industry, or ZASpace Inc. for that matter. Okay, and so that branding becomes very important because how does the industry ride on that brand value? And so repositioning has already started in terms of that brand value. And then we're also looking at internally systems and processes. So we're also looking at the enterprise architecture, overhauling our IT systems, our processes and procedures. In fact, we're just going through reviewing our current policies, SANZA policies and processes. How do we align that to the new business model? So what I'm trying to get to at this point is there's a lot of work happening inside of SANZA, or starting to happen as well, on a number of different fronts, to reposition and reshape the organization to be able to look at this ecosystem approach. So Kamal, that's essentially just to give you a flavor as to where we are. And then my last slide, opportunities. On the 23rd of August, the BRICS countries will be signing an agreement on a remote sensing satellite constellation. Okay. At the moment, we don't have anything earmarked for from a South African perspective in terms of the constellation itself, but this is where the Space Infrastructure Hub brings that opportunity. So how do we have a whole suite of constellation from the BRICS countries that now becomes part of a operational mission where SANZA can leverage on and also contribute? The other thing I should mention, there's now a focus within the BRICS countries on CubeSat missions. Now, if you look at where South Africa is regarded with regards to CubeSat at the moment, I think South Africa is a huge opportunity in that space. I think South Africa is highly progressive with regards to CubeSat compared to the other BRICS countries. And so if you're going to pursue that quite hard, it's going to be a huge opportunity for the industry to embrace those kind of opportunities. ICT Spring meeting, That's going to happen in Luxembourg on the 14th to the 15th of September. We already got a communication from the Luxembourg Space Agency wanting a collaboration mechanism with SANZA. But what the initial indications are on that collaborative mechanism is that actually what we want is an industry-to-industry engagement. So very similar to what ZARSpace Inc. did with Brazil, having that industry-to-industry engagement. We're looking at the same with Luxembourg. Okay, so Luxembourg has huge intentions about space resource mining and so on, but we'll see what kind of benefits can accrue from an industry-to-industry collaboration. On the 21st to the 22nd of September, there's a G20 meeting which is being hosted by Italy. And we've already got a communication from the Italian Space Agency to say, we want you to participate in the G20 meeting, the heads of space agencies, but we would also like for you to bring in 4 industry players into this conversation. There's an industry track as part of the G20 meeting in September. So we're working with ZARSpace Inc. just to identify how do we bring the relevant industry players into that conversation. And then towards the October timeframe, there's the Expo 2021 Dubai, in Dubai, in the UAE. That's a week preceding the IAC in Dubai, which is from the 25th to the 29th of October. So it's quite conveniently clustered over 2 weeks. We've been working, Intosh has been working with the DTIC. So that particular week from the 18th onwards will be a focus on space. So we're trying to see in terms of securing an exhibition space, bringing in the industry to come and showcase and exhibit. And then once we break that down, the following week, we can then just throw that across to the IAC in Dubai. So that's what we're working on. These are all interventions where there's opportunities for industry. So Kamal, these are the conversations we're having in the back end between ourselves and your team. So we'll see how that gets pulled through to the industry itself. So I'm going to stop there. That's our presentation.
That's fantastic, Val. Thank you. I know there's a bunch of questions lining up, but before we go there, I think maybe just a quick comment on those events. We've started with circulating information around certainly the ICT Spring event. That was the most recent one. We're certainly looking to replicate the Brazil industry-to-industry event with as many of these industries or country collaborations as we can. So as they come in and they get formalized through SANZA, we're going to start the process of setting up virtual events, which is obviously the cheapest from a travel point of view. But certainly in the Italian event and the Dubai event, we need to identify appropriate representation across up and downstream to take to those events. So that's about to go out. Val's preempted that communication. So that's about to be shared with the member base in the next week or so. But Val, thank you so much for that. I think it's a good way to bring this kind of conversation to an end. I still think we should see, time permitting, if we can unpack what that co-creation feels like, get some views from the floor. But in the meantime, I'm going to have to refer you to that Q&A chat, which has gotten very busy. Some I think have been answered. I see Amal has contributed. Some have been directed to you. So if you don't mind, Eugene is answering one of them from Lisecha. If we could quickly go through that and see if we can tick those off.
Yeah. Lisecha is asking, how will the RSA state-owned council pronouncement and SOE bill affect the current plans? I'm not sure what's behind the question, but I'm not sure if I will be answering the question. But from our perspective, we realize that a lot of what we have to do is around positioning SANZA to look at the ecosystem. Okay. Now, a lot of the state-owned entities are running into issues because it's more about survival from an organizational point of view. I think the marked departure for SANZA is we recognize that if the industry is sustainable, then SANZA will also be sustainable. There's a codependency between SANZA and the industry. And I think that's very different from how other public entities are viewing themselves vis-a-vis the local industry. So I'm thinking that we actually have a departure point in terms of how we positioning ourselves going forward. In fact, when the minister launched made the announcement around the Space Infrastructure Hub, the one thing he said in our pre-planning meeting was that this is probably what other state-owned entities need to learn, is how to become more self-sustainable. And I think SANZA, together with ZASpace Inc., is leading on that one. For the SATCOM satellite, we already identified and secured strategic orbital slots. That is identification, yeah. So there's two aspects to this in terms of approach, and I think Eugene is here as well. There is one way of doing it is where you go out and procure a satellite, and obviously to do that and get that launched, you need an orbital slot. To do that is going to take about 5 years. Now we think there's other options on the table. So a venture capital approach where there's an existing satellite and access to an orbital slot will probably be more cost effective. So those kind of options are framed in the strategy in terms of how do we get access to a SATCOM's satellite as quickly as possible. So without going into specific details, because between ourselves and Centec, we'll have to figure out what the most cost-effective and the best option is. Looking at. So that will also determine whether we actually have to secure an orbital slot or use an existing orbital slot that we can get access to. Shafiq, is there an indication of revisiting an African constellation in order to reduce? Yeah, so Shafiq, that's exactly what Amal is saying. There is some level of engagement with the ARMC. The good thing at the moment, unfortunately, it didn't happen sooner because of COVID-19 and travel restrictions, is that SANZA is currently chairing the ARMC consortium. And we met, I think it was in 2017, 2018, actually. And we had a meeting. And I think even Nigeria is making some level of pronouncements around the ARMC at the moment. So we're trying to pull the partners together, but we want to make sure we have something on the table through the Space Infrastructure Hub and draw in our African partners into some of these initiatives. So there's a level of strategic or tactical planning in terms of how we can pull this together with our African partners. Shafiz is asking about what about human resourcing in facilitating space engineering and a key focus on training engineers. I don't know if Amal is able to be put on the speaker, Kamal. Because Amal is driving a huge intervention around.
Yes, Phil. I see Amal has responded to Shafiq on that, but I'm pretty sure Amal can unmute if he wants to contribute. Is that fine?
Yeah, that should be fine. Amal, can you hear us?
Yeah, well, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Shafiq, for that question. I think what is fundamentally important for us is skills development and capability, right? And there's sort of many ways of approaching this here. If you look at the concurrent design facility, the facility is not only obviously for space missions, but it's for other engineering design requirements as well. What we would like to do, and we are engaging ESA at the moment, is how we could use the facility for training and development as well. So, for example, we could create a mock mission and say, look, we want to develop a satellite with these particular requirements. You can have young engineers from university and industry working together to try and come up with some of the pre-feasibility work, looking at a potential specification of the satellite. So they're really getting hands-on experience using the concurrent engineering facility. I also want to emphasize the fact that if you look at the Space Infrastructure Hub, it's quite a big program, right? And there's a fair percentage of the development is in the upstream, right, with the satellite development. Now, in that process, there may be some elements of research and development that will happen. We foresee that there'll be a fair amount of capacitation in terms of masters and PhDs coming through on the development of that program itself. And quite often, what you actually need is to have very hands-on experience on a program to develop the right capability. So it's not necessarily an academic study. And we can do simulations, obviously, on a computer. You can do many other, sorry, master's and PhD theses. But a very hands-on approach is what we'd like to endeavor towards in the SIH itself. So yes, training and development capability is critical. There is, we've recently recruited our chief engineer as well, who's looking at a potential research and development roadmap for space engineering. And when you start talking about research and development, you're talking about areas where they are sort of lower TRL levels. So it could be, some new elements in development, some new concepts in development, and there could be some areas where, there's a high level of technology readiness levels, and you may need to bring in some capability to extend the development to completion. So based on a roadmap going forward, we would fit those gaps and skills requirement. So I suppose that's sort of partly answers the question, but we can talk a lot more about this, on a one-on-one basis. Thanks.
Thank you, Amal. Thanks for that contribution, and Val, to your clarity as well. Is there something you want to add to that, Val?
No, I think Amal has covered that aspect in terms of the HR aspect. Yeah. In the training.
Have we covered off all the questions? I think between Intosh and Amal and
Eugene
and Val, they seem to have touched on all of them. I do have an anonymous attendee, a Swedish startup. I think if you happy to share your email address with ZA Space, we'll gladly connect with you to see who would be the most appropriate person to connect you with. So no problem with doing that. All right, so we've come pretty much to the end of the session, save for maybe opening the floor, Val, to just getting views on. You spoke a lot about the co-creation. You spoke a lot about opportunities, new opportunities beyond the SIH, and I think it's incredibly exciting that you will share those downstream requirements. Gary's prompted a question around that. And not to mention so many other initiatives that are en route in the communications industry, etc. So I'm keen to open this conversation up to the attendees to take some ideas on how can we support SANZA on making co-creation real. Because notwithstanding, we're all aware of the procurement challenges and so on and so forth. We all are aware that there's some amazing organizations doing amazing things from an export point of view, and they're servicing. In fact, several of them recently announced their components up in space, and part of missions already. So there's some fantastic organizations there. What can we do more, and what would industry want to do more to work closer with Val and the SANZA team, not just on SIH, but potentially on other initiatives. I think one of the key things we've done as our space on behalf of the industry is to set up and formalize monthly check-ins with Eugene and Val and Andiswa as the core members of the SANZA team, and others as well, as we now go through this bankable feasibility exercise to check in with on a regular basis on the progress and anything further that can be done supported by industry in order to get us to where we'd like to be. So any other ideas, any suggestions, any volunteers to assist the process over the next few months? Because I think it's jointly critical that we come out with a viable, implementable blueprint for the space infrastructure.
Come on, I'm assuming you're asking this to the industry players in attendance, right?
But you're more than welcome to answer this. But no, it is focused, really, it's an open conversation. It needn't be just from people from the industry. I see several SANZA colleagues also online. So if there are some ideas that we can take forward and execute, From a ZAR space and from a SANZA point of view, there's been constant communication. I think the appointment of the GTAC has been a big milestone. Not too much has been possible up until that point, but now that it's there, Eugene and his team have the capacity and the capability to support the exercise. We've established the equivalent of a steering committee, for want of a better word, between ZAR space and SANZA. Is there more? Are there additional ideas, particularly on the communication side? There are quite a few questions asked about that. Are there other forums, are there other initiatives we can look at to give life to this principle that we are both accepting, this principle of co-creation? And I'm quite happy if there aren't. But the lines stay open. If there are suggestions, if there are ideas, I know Lesecha is quite engaged right now with Francois and a few other members of the ZAR Space board. He's driving some exciting opportunities. We're speaking a lot with the upstream at the moment. And from a ZAR Space point of view, we're very committed to looking for, apart from attendees to visit those events, but we're very committed to establishing the Space Technology Fund with SANZA, and part of that is going to be soon coming to market to look for bankable early stage businesses that we can build the Space Technology Fund around. We have a comment on the Q&A side, I think. Only robust policies will do. I love co-creation philosophy, public-private partnership. So noted. But is there anything from your side that you'd want to add from the co-creation? I know we use it a lot. Now it's a matter of making it real.
Yeah, maybe this, Kamal. I've been talking about what ZAR Space Inc. has been doing in this whole philosophy of co-creation. And in fact, the industry report that you put together on the 7 work streams, you know, when I start talking about what ZAR Space Inc. has done and how we, between ourselves, SANZA and ZAR Space Inc. have been working together to look at this co-creation philosophy, you can see the eyes pop, because colleagues want to know, is like, how are you actually achieving this? It's very difficult in many different environments in the global space sector. And I think to make this point, what we are doing here between SANZA and ZAR Space Inc. is very unique. And in fact, I might even go as far as saying we're probably leading the way. So in many of the space programs, where they talk about the US and so on, industry is very key. And there's a strong collaboration between the agency and the industry. But I think what SANZA and ZAR Space Inc. are doing collectively might be even more unique than that. I mean, those kind of initiatives with the industry getting involved is more organic. But here we are actually being more directed, is by saying what can we collectively doing rather than the agency dictating and putting out opportunities that the industry responds to. So I think we might be pathfinders in something that might be new in the sector as well. But I think it also takes, you open up the floor to the industry to give their viewpoints. And I think it's very important that the industry shares their viewpoints and their experiences for us to make optimum use of this co-creation conversation. Thanks.
Very good. And I think it's an ongoing one, Val, and thank you for that. It makes it makes everything worthwhile when we sing as pathfinding together. There are some good, very valid comments on the chat group, on the Q&A chat group from Gary, and I missed who sent the other one about the PPP partnerships, or public-private partnerships, active technology transfer through partnerships, and that is something that I also believe in, Gary, very strongly, which is why it is so important for us as our space to facilitate those industry-to-industry events in parallel to any MOUs and collaboration that SANZA signs up with any other agency. Because the simple view is, we need to connect business to business and then let businesses do what businesses do best, which is exactly that. Create partnerships and generate value, which is what our role is to continue to stimulate those partnerships. But I think enough said for a Tuesday. It is Tuesday afternoon. Val, thank you very much. I know you and the team have been under significant pressure on trying to maintain the initial timeline since the SIH were announced. So thank you for keeping the team together and the dream alive, so to speak. We're right here behind you, next to you, and looking forward to, at the end of this year, having a co-created bankable feasibility and a vision for SIH in place, which is what we need to get right. And thank you to all of the attendees. I know there's quite a cross-section from across industry, as well as Sansa and a few other places. So thank you for being here. Thanks for the interactions. And we'll keep you posted on the next industry briefing session, which will be in the next few months. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, Kamal. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.
We'll chat.